Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always appreciate my friend from Georgia, his thoughts and observations. Mr. Speaker, it's really intriguing that our friends across the aisle have been joining with the President in demanding that we in Congress give this administration, with its abuses and unaccountability of the IRS, using it as a political weapon to help win an election, that used the ATF to sell weapons, 2,000 or so, to get them in the hands of criminals, and then tried to use that violence that came from the weapons they forced into the hands of people that shouldn't have had them as a reason to try to take away Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans. This administration is one of the most arbitrary and capricious administrations in history. Executive orders have been used for things that, from the top to the bottom of this administration, they have said they could not use executive orders for, including forms of amnesty. I think over 20 times the President himself said he did not have authority to just grant amnesty, and yet he turned around and did it anyway. So this administration, with that kind of history over the last 7 years, for being so arbitrary and in some cases being very intentional in going after enemies, far beyond anything Nixon might have ever dreamed he might be able to do. The thought of giving this administration the power to just make a list of all the people that you don't want to ever fly or have a gun. Just make a list. We don't know exactly how you're making this list. There's no due process in creating the no-fly list. There's no due process in getting oneself off the no-fly list once the name is on the no-fly list. And Katie Pavlik with townhall.com said, talking of the President's speech, said President Obama called on Congress to pass legislation stripping anyone, including American citizens, on the terrorism no-fly list of the ability to purchase a firearm in the United States. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Nobody wants terrorists to have easy access to guns, and it certainly sounds bad when the argument is made that those currently on the terror watch list have the ability to do so. But here's the problem. The terror no-fly list is a mangled, bureaucratic mess of over 700,000 names. Yes, there are names on the list that are connected to terrorism, but nearly half of those names belong to people who have zero links to terrorism. Further down, she said that list, which contained 47,000 names at the end of George W. Bush's presidency, has grown to nearly 700,000 people on President Obama's watch. The fact that they are names, not identities, has led to misidentifications and confusion, ensnaring many innocent people. But surely those names are there for good reason, right? Not really. According to the technology website techdirt.com, 40% of those on the FBI's watch list, about 280,000 people, are considered to have no affiliation with recognized terrorist groups. All it takes is for the government to declare that there is a reasonable suspicion that someone could be a terrorist. There's no hard evidence required, and the standard is notoriously vague and elastic. So who ends up on the list? Who shouldn't, and why? Take, for example, Weekly Standard senior writer and Fox News contributor Steve Hayes, who was put on the no-fly list after a cruise. Stephen Hayes, a senior writer at Weekly Standard, was informed Tuesday that he had been placed on the department's Homeland Security terrorist watch list. Hayes, who spoke to Politico by phone on Tuesday, suspects the decision stems from U.S. concerns over Syria. Hayes and his wife recently booked a one-way trip to Istanbul for a cruise and returned to the U.S. a few weeks later via Athens. But the trouble is, nobody can say for sure why they're on the list, why they're not on the list, why they should not be on the list. Article says, but travel to certain regions isn't the only way you can get put on the list without due process. Anyway, The Intercept published a 166-page document outlining the government's guidelines for placing people on an expansive network of terror watch lists. And I just can't help but say, Mr. Speaker, it is hard to fathom that once the wonderful American people think about what the president's proposing, they're going to realize you can't trust this administration with your health care. You can't trust this administration to keep their promises that if you like your health insurance policy, you can keep it, because those promises from this administration weren't true. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Wasn't true. Turns out people in the administration knew all along that it wasn't true, yet they promised people those things anyway. So there are issues of trust. We know even when we're not talking about issues of intentional misrepresentation, just mismanagement, terrible policies. Look at the rules of engagement of our military. Under President Bush, there were just over 500 precious American lives that were lost in the war in Afghanistan over 7.25 years' time. Though the war had wound down, we were told by the president, basically won, things contained in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, during this wound down war of the last less than 7 years, this president's rules of engagement have contributed, not intentionally, but the mismanagement has helped create an environment for our military members, men and women, where we have lost 3 to 4 times more lives under Commander Obama than were lost under Commander Bush in more time that Commander Bush was over the operation. This is not the administration you want to trust to say, you just make out a list, even though the standards are vague, we don't know how somebody gets on, it's kind of up to you, judgment call on your part, and there's not a clear way to get off. I read an article where somebody had been trying for 8 years to get off of that list. Nonetheless, you just go ahead, Obama administration, bureaucrats in cubicles, people like Lois Lerner that hate conservatives, you just make out your list of people you don't want to ever be able to defend themselves or their homes or their loved ones with a weapon. You make out the list, and we'll keep them from flying, and we won't let them have a gun. That would be a disaster. Because when most Americans realize what the president was asking for, just carte blanche to put anybody he wanted to on a list and they could never get a gun, American people are fair. Majority pull for an underdog, and they are not going to pull for an overly abusive, bureaucratic, Kafkaesque administration to take out its revenge on someone it doesn't like and prevent them from being able to defend themselves and their loved ones. course, the New York Times, never an organization to let hypocrisy get in the way of being hypocritical. In 2014, this article points out from Breitbart by R. Hawkins that on April 18, 2014, the New York Times published a scathing editorial on the no-fly list, describing it as a violation, and I'm quoting, a violation of basic rights, unquote, and a list unsuitable for a, quote, democratic society premised on due process. Moreover, the New York Times addressed the imprecision of the list by explaining that a 2007 audit showed that half the names on the list were wrongly included. Adding insult to injury, there were 71,000 names on the list in 2007, which means 35,500 people were facing a denial of their constitutional rights for being on a list due to oversight or some similar mistake. So that seems to be pretty clear. The New York Times got it right in 2014, got it wrong now. But it is interesting. I reflect on what my friend, former member of Congress, Barney Frank, told me one day when we were on the same side of an issue. He shrugged and said, well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and I know my friend Barney Frank could prove that. There's an article entitled, FBI Investigates if Terror Group Arranged California Killer's Marriage. It's by Marissa Schultz and Yaron Steinbuck, dated December 9, 2015. Pointed out the FBI is investigating whether the online courtship of the future San Bernardino mass murderers was a match made in hell by a terror group to set in motion the radicalized duo's evil plan, Director James Comey said on Wednesday. Comey told the Senate Judiciary Committee that investigators do not yet know if a group like ISIS hatched the love and hate match between jihadist Sayed Rizwan Farouk and Tashfin Malik. Further down, it says the top G-men also said that Farouk, 28, Malik, 29, were radicalized at least 2 years ago and planned their evil martyrdom scheme long before they were engaged and before she applied for a visa. The couple, who lived in a two-bedroom townhouse with their 6-month-old daughter and Farouk's mother, killed 14 people, wounded 21 during a holiday party December 2nd at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino. They were killed about 4 hours later in a shootout with police. Our investigation to date shows that they were radicalized before they started courting or dating each other online, and as early as the end of 2013, were talking to each other about jihad and martyrdom before they became engaged and married and were living in the U.S. A U.S. government source familiar with the shooting probe said Farouk may have been plotting an attack in the U.S. as early as 2011. That's hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, because this administration was doing all these things, reaching out, not helping Christians who are being persecuted in greater numbers than ever in the history of the world. No, not reaching out to specifically help Christians and Jews who are the primary targets of these radical Islamists, these people who perpetrate hate crimes that this administration won't even call hate crimes. This administration that every time it seems that they reach out overseas, or even, for heaven's sake, with our NASA space program, the president is directing that we got to protect Muslims above all other things. This same administration who appointed an attorney general who, after this mass murder spree in San Bernardino has the Attorney General come out, and while others, local police, other good, clear-thinking people are saying, if you see something, say something, Attorney General Lynch goes out after knowing that neighbors saw suspicious activity by these, what they knew to be Muslims apparently, in the garage, lots of packages, but they were afraid of saying something because it was politically incorrect. And now, Mr. Speaker, it's been made clear by the Attorney General that if you are a neighbor in the position like those of Farouk and Malik, and you see something you think is suspicious that someone with an Islamic background is doing, and you call that in, our Attorney General just may, according to what she said, decide not to go after the Islamic terrorists, but to come after you for being a bigot and for showing bias or prejudice. I can't imagine a more ridiculous thing to say after radical jihadists kill Christians, Jews. Yes, apparently there was at least one Muslim shot, but the killing occurred because of the hate for Christians and Jews and the desire to create terror in the hearts of infidels. So no Muslim was actually targeted by these radical Islamists. They were collateral damage. They should never have been shot. Anybody that had anything to do with shooting of a Muslim or Christian or Jew or atheist or Buddhist or anything else should be brought not just to justice, but when it's an act of war like this, they ought to be taken out. And the Attorney General, on the other hand, in the immediate aftermath of this bloody massacre, tragic at a Christmas party, threatens American citizens. If you become, in effect, is what she's saying, not the words, but in effect, she's saying, you become suspicious of people who are acting in the same way that you've seen on television or in the news, acting as radical Islamists, and you report that, we'll come after you because you're showing bigotry and prejudice. So on the one hand, if you see something, say something, but if it's about a Muslim, then there's a good chance we'll come after you, not the Islamists. There's a report from CNN's Zachary Cohen, Amnesty report, ISIS is armed with U.S. weapons. This is dated today. A new report from a prominent human rights group has found that ISIS has built a substantial arsenal, including U.S.-made weapons obtained from the Iraqi army and Syrian opposition groups. Amnesty International's 44-page report, released late Monday, found that much of ISIS equipment and munitions comes from stockpiles captured by U.S. allied Iraqi military and Syrian rebels. Further down, after analyzing thousands of videos and images taken in Iraq and Syria, Amnesty determined that a large proportion of ISIS' current military arsenal is made up of, quote, weapons and equipment looted, captured, or illicitly traded from poorly secured Iraqi military stocks. And we saw over and over, Mr. Speaker, that this administration had this ridiculous idea way too late after there were vetted moderate Syrian rebels that we could have helped. It decides to get involved, and over and over and over, they sent heavy equipment, heavy weapons to these so-called vetted moderate Syrian rebels who said they feel a lot closer to those members of ISIS than they do the United States. And lo and behold, those heavy weapons that are being used to kill the Kurds, the courageous Kurds that are fighting them, they're using United States military weapons. To this administration's credit, got to give it to them, there were a period about 4 or 5 months where, because the weapons they kept sending to the Syrians kept ending up in ISIS hands, they decided to hold up shipping them more weapons because we just were equipping ISIS. But for some ridiculous, unknown, has to be ridiculous, this administration began sending weapons back again. And as far as I know, they're still doing so. I also think it's important, since this administration has pointed to George W. Bush and his originally saying that this was not Islamic, and although this administration has blamed the Bush administration, normally it's quite unfairly, for every problem that's arisen. In fact, I believe it was in Iowa, someone told me that they understood that the president wanted to have the San Andreas Fault renamed for President George W. Bush, so it would be known as Bush's Fault. But that's what this administration has done, and yet they try to blame him for their saying that ISIS, that wasn't around when President Bush was president, it only was created when this president created a vacuum in the Middle East, that, gee, these people who claim to be Islamic, that they're not Islamic. And I keep going back to the fact that one of the most internationally recognized experts on Islam and Islamic law, Islamic studies, and on the Quran, got his degrees, including PhD, I'd read, from the University of Baghdad in Islamic studies. And his name is al-Baghdadi. He's the head of ISIS, and he claims as head of ISIS that ISIS is indeed Islam. The president doesn't have any degrees in Islamic studies, although he did apparently study Islam quite clearly as a young child in Indonesia. Nonetheless, I think al-Baghdadi's credentials on what is Islam and what is not are superior to those in the White House, of anybody in the White House. But Carolyn Glick, a writer for the Jerusalem Post, makes a great point in one of her articles from back November 24th, 2015. She says, an attempt is being made to assert that there is no pluralism in Islam. It's either entirely good or entirely evil. She's making a great point about pluralism because, well, as she says, this absolutist position is counterproductive for two reasons. First, it gets you nowhere good in the war against radical Islam. The fact is that Islam per se is none of the U.S. president's business. His business is to defeat those who attack the U.S. and to stand with America's allies against their common foes. Radical Islam may be a small component of Islam, or a large one, but it certainly is a component of Islam. Its adherents believe they are good Muslims, and they base their actions on their Islamic beliefs. American politicians, warfighters, and policymakers need to identify that form of Islam, study it, and base their strategies for fighting the radical Islamic forces on its teachings. That's why my friends like Muslims, Masood, Dustam, others who fought and initially defeated the Taliban within about 5 months in Afghanistan, courageous, They don't want radical Islamists governing Afghanistan. In Egypt, a very fine man, courageous man, President al-Sisi, he has stood up to imams and pointed out that you must take back Islam and denounce the radical Islamists that are destroying our religion. They recognize this is Islamic. They're claiming to be Islamic, and we have got to clean up our own religion. Well, Judicial Watch released information today. ODNI confirms terrorists tried to enter U.S. as Syrian refugees. They point out that FBI Assistant Director Michael Steinbach has conceded that the U.S. government has no system to properly screen Syrian refugees. The concern in Syria is that we don't have systems in place on the ground to collect information to vet. That would be the concern, is we would be vetting databases don't hold the information on those individuals. You're talking about a country that is a failed state, that is, does not have any infrastructure, so to speak. So all the data sets, the police, the intel services that normally you would go to seek information don't exist. Very important. Now, I know that some people are trying to say that Donald Trump, and I did not endorse him, I endorsed Ted Cruz for president, but they're trying to vilify Trump because he perhaps overstated, but he's made clear we need a pause until we figure out our policy. Yet Huma Abedin, wife of Anthony Weiner, our former colleague here, that she was denouncing Trump and says Trump wants to literally write racism into our law books. His homophobia doesn't reflect our nation's values. It goes far enough to damage our country's reputation and could even threaten our national security. Mr. Speaker, I pointed out yesterday this information that we obtained after letters were sent to departments just mentioning a couple of facts about her family. And then we find out that she has these direct ties to Abdullah Omar Nassif, who had ties to Osama bin Laden, and really serious issues, not just through her mother that started the Muslim Sisterhood, her father, her late father, deceased for many years now, but who was a prominent member of the Muslim Brotherhood, brother who had ties, but she had ties herself, and to Nassif and others. And when you find out the contacts that she herself, close personal ties she had, you wonder, how in the world could a person like this be attached to at the time, First Lady Hillary Clinton, in the Clinton years, in the Clinton White House? How could that happen? And then, of course, over the years, she's become ingratiated to Hillary Clinton, been her closest confidant. Not much of anything happens, as we found from the emails, without Huma Abedin Weiner being in the middle of it. Wow. Then I just want to point out something else that has come out in recent years. And I'll just read this. I don't normally, I don't espouse that Wikipedia is all that reliable, but here's what they say about Abdul Rahman al-Amoudi, that he is an American former Muslim activist known for founding the American Muslim Council. He was born in Eritrea, raised in Yemen, immigrated to the U.S. He formed the council. The aim was to inform and influence both Republicans and Democrats. In 1998, al-Amoudi was involved with the selection of Muslim chaplains for the U.S. military, and acted as a consultant to the Pentagon for over a decade. During this time, al-Amoudi served as an Islamic advisor to President Bill Clinton and a fundraiser for both the Republican and Democratic parties. More recently, Al-Moody worked with leading conservatives such as Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. Al-Moody became a U.S. citizen in 1996. Al-Moody and other Muslim leaders met with then presidential candidate George W. Bush in Austin in July of 2000, offering to support his bid for the White House in exchange for Bush's commitment to repeal anti-terrorist laws. He even spoke at a service for the victims of 9/11. He's now doing 23 years in prison for supporting terrorism. He was helping the Clinton administration find people for different jobs. I'm trying to find out, Mr. Speaker, could he have had anything to do before he went to prison with placing Huma Abedin as an intern with Hillary Clinton? Mr. Speaker, I can't get an answer, so I yield back this evening.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.